When people think about the Old West, they usually picture dusty towns, men in wide-brimmed hats, quick-draw duels in the middle of the street, and gunslingers with perfect aim and a personal code of honor. Hollywood made sure we all bought into that image. But the truth, it's a lot messier and way more interesting. The reality of the American frontier was full of contradictions, unexpected details, and a whole lot of myths that just don't hold up when you look closer. In this video, we're breaking down some of the dumbest and most persistent things people still believe about Old West gunslingers. From who they were and how they lived, to what kind of weapons they carried and how justice actually worked. A lot of what we think we know is just fiction dressed up as fact. So, if you're ready to drop the movie cliches and take a serious look at what the Old West was really like, let's get into it. Number 1. Everyone was in a shootout. Every day. One of the most common misconceptions about life in the Old West is the belief that shootouts were a daily occurrence. Popular culture, especially old Western films and TV shows, has created an image where saloons, dusty streets, and front porches were constant battle zones, with gunslingers ready to draw at the slightest insult. In reality, this is a highly exaggerated view of how things actually were. Shootouts did happen, but they were not as frequent or as dramatic as many people imagine. Most people living in Western towns were not gunslingers or outlaws. They were settlers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and laborers, just trying to live their lives. The majority of conflicts were settled through words, threats, or physical fights, not by immediately reaching for a weapon. The idea that every minor disagreement ended in a shootout ignores the fact that people, even in the harsh environment of the frontier, generally wanted to avoid unnecessary violence. Firearms were dangerous and unpredictable, and getting shot in the 1800s often meant a slow and painful death due to limited medical care. Because of this, even those known for carrying guns understood that using one wasn't something to take lightly. Even the most famous gunfights, like the one at the OK Corral in Tombstone, are often misunderstood. That event, which people often picture as an epic showdown lasting minutes, was over in less than half a minute and involved very specific tensions between lawmen and a group of outlaws who had already been threatening violence. It wasn't a random bar fight or a spur-of-the-moment duel. In fact, many towns in the Old West had strict gun control laws in place, especially within city limits. Visitors were often required to turn in their weapons when they arrived. Law enforcement, though not always consistent, existed and worked to maintain order because chaos wasn't good for business, settlement, or safety. Gunslingers themselves were usually not the reckless killers they're often portrayed to be. Many were skilled marksmen and former soldiers or lawmen who used their guns sparingly and strategically. They understood the consequences of pulling the trigger. There was more calculation and caution than wild bravado. Living in the Old West involved plenty of danger, but it didn't look like a non-stop action movie. The reality was slower, more uncertain, and a lot more complicated than the myth of the daily duel. Number 2, gunslingers were either heroes or villains. One of the most misleading ideas people have about Old West gunslingers is the assumption that they fell neatly into one of two roles, either as righteous lawmen defending order, or as ruthless outlaws spreading chaos. This oversimplified narrative is largely a product of early Western fiction and Hollywood movies that needed clear-cut characters to tell entertaining stories. The actual reality was far more complicated and morally unclear. Most gunslingers didn't live strictly by any code of honor or villainy. They existed in a gray area where personal survival, opportunity, and power often dictated their choices more than any loyalty to law or crime. Many well-known figures from the Old West had reputations that didn't align cleanly with one role or the other. Some, like Wyatt Earp, wore a badge and upheld the law in certain towns, but were also involved in gambling, brothel management, and various disputes that ended violently. These were not clean, rule-following officers of justice. They were men shaped by a violent time, doing what they had to do to maintain control or gain respect. The same can be said for others like Wild Bill Hickok, who had moments of genuine law enforcement, alongside periods where he acted with personal motives and little concern for due process. These men often bent the law when it suited them, and their reputations were as much the result of self-promotion and public storytelling as they were of actual deeds. On the other side, not every outlaw was a cold-blooded killer. Many turned to crime out of necessity, especially in a region with limited opportunity, unstable income, and frequent injustice. Some were former soldiers or ranch hands who couldn't find steady work. Others were victims of broken promises from railroads, banks, or land speculators. In some cases, individuals branded as criminals were just caught up in local feuds or conflicts and never received a fair trial. A few even transitioned into roles as lawmen later in life, depending on how local politics and personal alliances shifted. What this all points to is a much messier, more human picture of gunslingers in the Old West. These weren't black and white characters, but real people making hard decisions in a time without reliable law enforcement, where personal reputation could be more powerful than any legal authority. The idea of clear-cut heroes and villains might make for good storytelling, but it's a poor way to understand how things actually worked in that unpredictable, dangerous era. Number 3. They all carried six-shooters on their hips. The image of every gunslinger in the Old West walking around with a Colt Peacemaker openly strapped to their hip is one of the most enduring and misleading myths. While that specific revolver did become iconic over time, not everyone in the West owned one, and even among those who did, it wasn't always worn the way we imagine today. Hollywood and dime novels helped create this overly simplified picture of what frontier life looked like, but real gun ownership and carry practices were shaped by practicality, local laws, personal preference, and economics. First, carrying a firearm openly in a hip holster was not always the norm, particularly inside established towns. In many Western settlements like Dodge City or Tombstone, local ordinances were put in place to limit violence by requiring visitors to check their firearms upon entry. Sheriffs and marshals actually enforced these laws to keep the peace, since too many armed strangers in one place could quickly lead to chaos. Publicly displaying a weapon wasn't always seen as a sign of toughness. It could be taken as a provocation, especially in tense or unfamiliar situations. As a result, people often concealed their firearms or carried them in less visible ways, such as inside coats, under shirts, or using shoulder rigs. Even among those who did carry revolvers, the models varied. Not everyone could afford a brand new Colt. Many used older black powder pistols, pocket revolvers, or other cheaper weapons, and rifles or shotguns were actually more common on ranches, during travel, or in serious confrontations. The idea that everyone was walking around with the same sleek six-shooter ready for a dramatic showdown is pure fantasy. Guns were tools, not fashion statements, and their use was usually rooted in necessity, not style. The popular image of the fast-draw duel at high noon, where two men square off in the middle of the street with matching six-shooters, also doesn't reflect reality. Most violent encounters were sudden, chaotic, and at close range. People didn't line up for a fair fight. They reacted quickly, often from cover, and rarely gave warning. Gunplay wasn't about skillful choreography or theatrical twirls. It was about who could survive when things went wrong fast. Number 4, the Wild West was full of white cowboys. One of the most persistent and misleading ideas about the Old West is the belief that it was almost entirely populated by white cowboys riding across open plains, living by their own code and taming the frontier. This image has been reinforced for decades by movies, TV shows, and novels that consistently centered white characters while leaving out the diverse and complex reality of who actually built and worked the American West. In truth, a significant portion of the cowboy population, some estimates say roughly 1/3, was made up of black men, Mexicans, Native Americans, and people of mixed heritage. These individuals weren't just present. They were essential to the daily function of ranch life and the development of Western culture. After the Civil War, many formerly enslaved black men headed west in search of opportunities that didn't exist in the post-slavery South. The ranching industry offered hard but steady work, and black cowboys proved to be skilled riders, cattle herders, and ranch hands. Despite facing discrimination, many gained reputations for their abilities and became respected members of trail crews. They were part of every major cattle drive and often worked the same routes and trails as their white counterparts. Their contributions were real and lasting, but rarely acknowledged in the popular stories that later defined the genre. Mexican vaqueros had been managing cattle and training horses in the Southwest long before the cowboy lifestyle took hold in American culture. Much of what is now considered traditional cowboy gear and technique, saddles, roping methods, even the idea of the roundup, originated with these early horsemen. American cowboys learned directly from them and adopted many of their tools and skills, though that influence has often gone uncredited in popular retellings of Western history. Native Americans were also a major part of the story, though their role was complex and shaped by both resistance and adaptation. Some worked as scouts, guides, or ranch hands, especially when the traditional ways of life became harder to maintain due to forced relocations and broken treaties. Others fought fiercely to protect their land, their people, and their culture. The reality of native life during this time varied widely depending on the tribe, the region, and the pressures they faced from expanding American settlements. The truth is, the Old West was never the homogeneous, white-dominated world often portrayed in fiction. It was a tough, dangerous place shaped by many cultures working side by side, sometimes in conflict, sometimes in cooperation. The cowboy image that became so iconic is only a narrow piece of a much larger, more diverse history. Understanding who was really there and what they contributed gives a far more accurate picture of how the American West actually functioned. Number 5. Guns were super accurate and fast. There's a widespread misunderstanding about how effective and advanced guns were during the Old West era. Thanks to modern movies and stylized portrayals of Western shootouts, people tend to imagine revolvers hitting targets with perfect precision from long distances and being reloaded in seconds during intense fights. The truth, however, is much less glamorous. Firearms of the time were useful for what they were designed to do, but they had serious limitations in both accuracy and reliability, especially under stressful or rushed conditions. Take the iconic Colt Peacemaker, for example, a widely used revolver often seen as the symbol of the gunslinger. While it was popular and respected for its durability, it wasn't a high-precision weapon by today's standards. The effective range of a revolver like that was short, and shooting accurately required skill, a steady hand, and the ability to stay calm. The further away your target was, the lower your chances of hitting it, especially in a real confrontation where your heart is racing, and you might only get 1 or 2 shots off before everything turns into chaos. Rifles had better accuracy at a distance, but even those couldn't guarantee clean hits from hundreds of yards away, particularly in fast-moving or improvised situations. Reloading was another issue. Most revolvers had to be loaded manually, 1 round at a time. This meant opening the cylinder, removing spent cartridges, inserting fresh ones, and resetting the weapon. Something that could take well over a minute under pressure. Speed loaders and swing-out cylinders, which made reloading quicker, were introduced much later, and weren't available to the average gun owner at that time. In the middle of a fight, there often wasn't enough time or safety to reload, unless you had backup weapons or help. Gun malfunctions were also a real concern. Black powder firearms were dirty by nature and required constant maintenance. A poorly cleaned or damaged weapon could misfire, jam, or fail completely. And since there were no quality control standards like we have today, not every gun was equally reliable or well built. Misfires weren't just possible, they were expected in some cases, especially with cheaper weapons or ammunition that had degraded due to moisture or time. Number 6. Outlaws were always wanted dead or alive. One of the most persistent myths about the Old West is the idea that every outlaw had a bounty on their head and was being actively hunted by fearless bounty hunters chasing posters nailed to every saloon door. Popular culture has turned this image into something iconic, but the reality behind it was much more complicated, far less organized, and often didn't involve any posters at all. The famous phrase, "wanted dead or alive," sounds dramatic, but it wasn't something that appeared universally, and even when it did, it wasn't always legally backed or clearly defined. Most criminals in the Old West weren't targets of high-profile manhunts. The majority were arrested by local lawmen or sheriffs who knew the area and the people involved. These were small communities, and many crimes were personal or involved people who weren't strangers to one another. A lot of enforcement was informal and based on local relationships or community pressure, not formal bounty contracts. The notion that professional bounty hunters were roaming from town to town, collecting rewards for dangerous criminals, is mostly exaggerated. They did exist, but not in the romanticized way films portray them. Many were drifters or hired guns who were as unpredictable as the people they were chasing. Even the wanted posters themselves were inconsistent. Not every town had access to a printing press, so many notices were handwritten or passed around by word of mouth. Some towns would post bulletins on a general store wall or at the sheriff's office, but those rarely included phrases like dead or alive. That specific wording wasn't just legally questionable, it could lead to serious consequences. Killing someone who was supposed to be taken into custody could result in legal challenges, especially if it looked more like murder than an arrest attempt. Towns didn't want unnecessary violence drawing attention or creating feuds. The idea of bounty hunting as a noble profession is also misleading. It was dangerous, poorly regulated, and often involved people who didn't care much about justice. Some were in it for the money alone and weren't concerned with who got hurt in the process. Others used the title as a cover for vigilante violence or personal revenge. The job didn't come with authority or immunity, and bounty hunters could be prosecuted if they acted outside the law or used excessive force. In truth, the justice system in the Old West was inconsistent, heavily influenced by local politics, and not built around bounty culture the way people often assume. The dramatic manhunt scenes we associate with Outlaws were the exception, not the rule. Most of the time, law enforcement was messier, quieter, and far more human than the legends suggest. Number 7, dueling was an honorable sport. The romantic idea of two gunslingers standing face to face at high noon, waiting in silence for the perfect moment to draw, is one of the most iconic images of the Old West. It's been shown so many times in films that people naturally assume it was a common and honorable way to settle disputes. But that version of a duel, organized, public, and supposedly fair, was extremely rare, and most actual confrontations were nothing like that. The truth is that violence in the Old West was far less predictable, much more chaotic, and rarely driven by any real code of honor. In most towns, what people now imagine as a formal duel simply didn't happen. There were no set rules, no countdowns, and definitely no referees. If someone had a problem with another man, it usually escalated quickly and ended without warning. Many shootings took place in crowded saloons, dark alleys, or from ambush. The trigger was often something personal: accusations of cheating at cards, arguments over land or livestock, jealousy involving a woman, or long-standing grudges. It wasn't about proving skill or settling matters with dignity. It was often an outburst of anger, fear, or desperation. The so-called honor involved in these encounters was more about ego and appearance than any structured code. In fact, many towns actively discouraged and even outlawed dueling, whether formal or informal. Local authorities didn't want that kind of chaos disturbing the peace or inviting revenge killings. Duels not only risked innocent lives, but also threatened the reputation of a settlement trying to grow and attract business. Sheriffs and marshals typically tried to shut down any hint of a planned gunfight before it could happen, because the aftermath often brought more problems than it solved. Furthermore, the outcome of a gunfight was usually determined in seconds and not necessarily by who was faster or better. Surprise, luck, and positioning played just as much of a role. Some men didn't even get their weapon drawn before it was over. There was nothing clean or honorable about it. It was brutal, unpredictable, and dangerous for everyone involved. The myth of the fair, respectable duel is just that, a myth. In reality, most violence in the Old West was ugly, personal, and far from the romantic image many people still hold today. Number 8, cowboys were all young rebels. The image of cowboys as young, reckless drifters living a wild and romantic life on the open range is more fiction than fact. While it's easy to picture a 20-something rebel chasing freedom and glory on horseback, the real cowboy life was far more practical, demanding, and routine-driven. Cowboys weren't out there writing their own stories. They were doing hard physical labor under tough conditions, often just to survive. In reality, many cowboys were older, experienced men who had worked in the trade for years, and their days were filled more with structure and exhaustion than adventure. Cattle drives and ranch work required endurance and discipline. It wasn't a glamorous lifestyle, and the pay was modest at best. Cowboys worked long days in rough terrain, managing herds of cattle across hundreds of miles. They rode in bad weather, dealt with wild animals, crossed rivers, and handled stampedes or theft from rustlers. There was no real comfort in the job. Nights were spent sleeping on the ground with a saddle for a pillow. Meals were repetitive and basic, and injuries or illness could end a career fast. It was a job built on survival, not rebellion. The work was also highly organized. Cowboys operated in teams, followed orders from trail bosses, and had to coordinate carefully to manage large herds. Tasks were divided and routines were strict. The idea of the lone cowboy doing whatever he wanted doesn't hold up when you consider how essential cooperation was on the trail. Independence was valued, but not at the expense of the group's safety or success. Most cowboys didn't own their horses, guns, or gear either. Those were usually supplied by the ranch or employer. Of course, some cowboys drank, gambled, or caused trouble when in town, but this wasn't the norm. Most were just laborers trying to earn a living in a difficult and unpredictable environment. The myth of the young rebel cowboy simplifies a much more complex reality. Real cowboys had responsibilities, limits, and lives shaped by work more than freedom. Number 9. Native Americans were just obstacles. One of the most damaging misconceptions about the Old West is the belief that Native Americans were simply barriers in the way of progress. Nameless enemies portrayed as little more than background threats in a larger story about settlers, cowboys, and outlaws. This idea, heavily shaped by early Western films and fiction, not only distorts historical reality but also strips Native peoples of their agency, complexity, and critical role in shaping the frontier. In truth, Native American tribes were not passive figures standing in the way. They were deeply involved in the events that defined the West, and their presence influenced every aspect of how that region developed. Tribes across the continent had their own political systems, alliances, and long histories of diplomacy and warfare, both among themselves and with European settlers. Some groups chose to negotiate an ally with settlers or the U.S. military, hoping to preserve their way of life or adapt to changing conditions. Others resisted with force, defending their homelands from invasion and refusing to surrender to expanding settlement and military pressure. There was no single unified Native American approach. Each tribe acted based on its leadership, its circumstances, and the challenges it faced. Reducing all Native people to hostile forces ignores the complex decisions they had to make in a rapidly changing and violent environment. Many Native individuals worked directly with settlers, as scouts, interpreters, guides, or even in trade. They knew the land better than anyone and were essential in navigating terrain, surviving harsh conditions, and understanding natural resources. Their knowledge shaped travel routes, military campaigns, and even settlement patterns. Yet, at the same time, they faced constant displacement, broken treaties, and violence. The expansion of the West was not a peaceful or fair process. It was marked by aggression, exploitation, and widespread betrayal of agreements. In many cases, settlers were the ones pushing into territory already lived on and cared for by Native people. To view Native Americans simply as obstacles is not just historically inaccurate. It erases the central role they played in the history of the West. They weren't just part of the landscape, they were active participants, defenders, leaders, and survivors. Understanding the reality of their involvement offers a far more honest view of how the West was truly shaped. Number 10. The Old West was lawless chaos. A common belief about the Old West is that it was a place of total disorder, where violence ruled and people did whatever they pleased without consequence. In movies and television, Western towns are often portrayed as dusty battlegrounds, filled with outlaws, drifters, and vigilantes, with no law in sight and no justice beyond what a gun could deliver. While certain regions and moments in time were indeed violent and unstable, the broader reality was far more structured and community-focused than the myth suggests. Most Western towns were not built on lawlessness but on the need for cooperation and stability. As settlements grew, they developed systems of governance to manage daily life. Towns appointed sheriffs, hired marshals, and held court sessions. There were jails for holding criminals and judges to rule on disputes. The legal system may have been inconsistent and sometimes corrupted by personal interest or local politics, but it did exist and it was often taken seriously. People couldn't just commit murder in broad daylight and expect to walk away without consequences, especially in more established towns like Dodge City or Abilene, where lawmen enforced local ordinances and responded to violence quickly. Beyond formal law, community expectations also played a major role in maintaining order. Settlers came west to build lives, not to live in fear or chaos. They built churches, schools, and businesses. They published local newspapers and formed councils. Neighbors looked out for one another, and many towns had unwritten rules that helped people coexist. While gunfights and robberies happened, they were not the daily norm. Most residents were ordinary people. Farmers, ranchers, storekeepers, blacksmiths, focused on work and family, not outlaw fantasies. Of course, there were remote frontier regions where law enforcement was minimal, and disputes were settled with violence. But even in those areas, people usually preferred order to conflict, because survival was hard enough without the added danger of unpredictable violence. The idea that the entire West was one giant free-for-all is an exaggeration shaped by stories that needed drama, not accuracy. In truth, while the West had its rough edges, it was built by people who cared about structure, safety, and building something that could last.